Hey everybody, how you doing? Welcome to the podcast. Great to have you tonight. Uh, the reason we're here tonight is because my son took a history course, and it's uh, every day. Hey, Mr. Campbell said this, Glenn or Papa. He would call me Papa. Hey, Mr. Campbell said that, and I said, "Who's Mr. Campbell?" Oh, he's my teacher. I said, "Sounds like to me you like him." He says, "Oh yeah. He's great." So we're gonna get to that in just a second. I want to make sure everybody knows Revival Conference is coming up this month, August 23rd, 24th. What is Revival? Revival is a deeper dive into your relationship with Christ. That's right. The sacrament of confirmation was given to us. The Holy Spirit was given to us. What does that look like? And do you have the Holy Spirit? Well, of course you do. But have you tapped into him? We're going to teach how to do that. And it's fun. It's really, I think, the fun part of the church that many of you are missing out. So mark your calendars. This sounds like an ad from the 70s and 80s. Mark your calendars. I feel like I'm on that thing you do again. Anyway, I wasn't on the show. But anyway, August 23rd, 24th, Sioux Falls, South Dakota. It costs nothing. It's free. Just come and do some praise and worship with us. There's some talks. I'm giving some talks. There's going to be some testimonies, and God will move. By the way, last time we did a revival, we had 6 physical healings. There's about 22, 25 of us there, pretty small, but 6 people got physically healed. Crazy, isn't it? And all we did is pray. Sounds like the early church. All right, so tonight, Mr. Phillip Campbell is with us. I really don't know much about him other than what my son has said, but we're going to bring him on here. If I can find him right there. Are you there?
I'm here.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen, welcome, Mr. Phillip Campbell. I've always wanted to do this. I've never really used these sound effects before, and I'll probably never do that again. Hey, you've got some people that are watching you right now.
Oh, I'm sorry for them.
Yeah, well, do you know who Genevieve Norris is?
Genevieve, my student from Louisiana.
Oh, I know Mr. C. He's an amazing teacher.
Oh, thank you, Genevieve.
We've got some hearts flying right now. I'm not even sure what that means. I think it's I love this guy. I don't even know what is that. What does a heart flying mean? Do you have any idea?
We'll just assume that that's good.
I think it is good. Yeah, I think it is good. All right, Octavius Tech. Anyway, welcome to the show. How are you doing tonight?
Hi, Jared. I'm doing very well. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. What do you think about this interview? I've been doing an interview about a personal testimony. What are your initial thoughts about that?
Oh, I love talking about my personal testimony. I first started, I've been doing public speaking for a long time. Usually people want to hear me talk about history, but then last year, podcasts and various programs started asking me about my personal testimony. And I've been getting more and more requests to share that. And then I was on,
No
I was even
kidding.
on EWTN's The Journey Home, sharing it not too long ago. So it's a
Oh,
popular story. I see my friend Jared is there. Hello, Jared. Nice to see you, dude. So I'm pretty comfortable sharing it. I never get tired of reflecting on God's mercy. So it's appropriate.
before we get started into the testimony, who is Coco the bear? Who's Coco the bear?
Coco the bear is my class mascot. It's a stuffed bear that I own that is like the official mascot of all my classes.
Oh, fun. I'm going to have to check this out. That comes from Judah Gauer, my oldest son, 17 years old. He's going to be mad that I brought his name into it, but sorry, Judah. And I tried like heck to get him on this podcast because he would probably do a better job than I would asking you questions. But so I didn't know you're on EWTN, the Journey Home. I honestly think the Lord really set this up because I don't know much of you at all, which is good. I'm going to get to learn more about you tonight. So let's start with tell me about yourself, where you grew up, and tell me a little bit about your family, your mom and dad, and if you have any siblings.
Yeah, I grew up in a little town called Howell, Michigan, which is in southeastern Michigan. It was a pretty small town for the time. I have one brother. We grew up kind of out in the country-ish, nice neighborhood, kind of idyllic upbringing, I guess. I mean, I think I had a pretty standard American 1980s, Midwest small town upbringing. So there was nothing particularly notable or exceptional about it. I mean, I was happy with it. I reflect fondly on it now. Um, so quite unassuming, I would say.
Hmm. How
But
about
go ahead.
no? How about tell me about your family? Your mom and dad. Where are they from originally?
They're both from Michigan as well. They came
Okay.
from the Metro Detroit area, and then we moved out to Howell like shortly before I was born to kind of get out of the city. My I remember my dad was the town chimney sweep, and
Oh.
my mom when I was young, she was just working at a grocery store, but she kind of worked her way through college when I was young, and then she eventually moved up and got a government job with the county, and eventually they ended up doing pretty well for themselves. We had a fairly decent house on 5 acres out in the country, so I was blessed to have a lot of room to run around in and explore. I had decent friends at school and in the neighborhood, and so I feel like I was pretty fortunate in the upbringing I had in that regard. We weren't a religious family or anything, though. My parents weren't. I mean, my dad came from a Sicilian family, so they were like culturally Catholic. My mom's family had been Catholic, but somehow they'd stopped practicing the faith before I was born. My dad, to my knowledge, never practiced the faith. So I had no like religious upbringing or anything. So I would say it was just a normal secular upbringing.
So no church going then.
No, never. I mean, maybe once in a while when I was very young, like sometimes if I'd stay the night at a friend's house and they went to church, I'd have to go to church with them in the morning. Or I remember my mom randomly signed me up for VBS one time for some reason when I was like 10, and I never understood why. I think she probably just vaguely thought I should have religion or something. But no, I never went to church. I don't think I went to my first church service until maybe I was 12 or 13. Although I do remember, I will say, I went to a Methodist preschool. We didn't have to go to church at the preschool, but I went to a Methodist preschool in town, and I remember they had their chapel with like a little candle. And during the week there was no services, obviously, so the chapel would just be dark, and I would see the candle. And I remember walking by it as a little child and always kind of like having what I now reflect on as like like uh, a sense of God's presence, or kind of like this is a separate space for worship, or this is something kind of like a sense of the otherness. And I've said in other interviews as well that like for me the concept of the divine, or like a spiritual reality behind all things, was never a difficult concept for me to grasp. It always seemed intuitive in everything. I never was one of those people who had to struggle to believe in a spiritual reality. It always just seemed
Okay.
like it was there. It just seemed like it was there from as early as I can remember. Um, and I remember first kind of becoming aware of it as I saw the inside of this church. Even though I wasn't going into the church sanctuary, it was kind of like attached to the preschool, and we'd walk by it. And I would look in the windows and kind of like sense there was something about a church space that was interesting to me.
Here's an interesting question. Looking back now, all these years, do you remember
Yeah.
a time when God spoke to you as a young boy and you didn't know it at the time, but now you think, I think God was speaking to me back then? I'm just curious.
Hmm. I've reflected on that a lot, and I can't say I remember specific things, but I see how he was kind of guiding me in many various ways in the interests I developed, in the way I perceive the world, in the people he put in my life, to kind of like whittle me into a certain character and put me in a certain place in the world, so that later, when the time for conversion had come, it was kind of just like pushing over dominoes, and everything just kind of would fall. When someone converts, and I'm not a new, this was a long time ago now. I've been Catholic for 22 years and Christian for even a little longer. But when a person first converts, they often experience a radical difference between their life before they knew the Lord and then after they knew the Lord. And that's right to experience that. It's like coming into the light. But then as you go and you reflect on your conversion, you start to think back to your experiences before your conversion, and you start to see how God didn't just suddenly erupt at one point in your life. He was really always there,
Mm-hmm.
kind of like leading you and guiding you in ways that you weren't aware of, till it's kind of like now I perceive him as always drawing me from my earliest, childhood memories, always being there.
Yeah, I'm from a really big family. My mom and dad had 13 kids, so I'm number 11 of 13, and my mom's sisters and brothers, they all but one had really pretty big families, and so family was really really big for me growing up
Yeah.
in the 80s. Do you remember that? Was it similar for you? And if so, what sorts of things did you do as family?
Well, my family was we were a small family. Like I only had one brother. My
Okay.
dad only had one brother. My grandpa only had, like we were a very small family all around. On my mom's side, there was more cousins, but we didn't always see them very much. So it was really just my parents and my brother and I. Um, so we didn't have that huge extended family that or even just the immediate family. But we did lots of things together. We went on vacations up north to the cabin on the lake, and we did road trips and did various things. Sometimes I think back on it, and it's just, yeah, it's very kind of generic but wholesome, 20th century Americana stuff. You know, so, but because I had a small family, I spent a lot of time by myself as well. I was on my own a lot.
Hmm.
Not in a solitary way, but just, I often was by myself. And my mom taught me to read very early. Like before I even went to first grade, my mom taught me to read. And I always amused myself with books, and writing and drawing and creative things. I always would spend a lot of time outside in the woods exploring and doing imaginative things. I like to read fantasy books, that helped nurture my imagination. So, yeah, we did things together as a family, but I also spent a considerable amount of time alone, learning to be entertained and nourished by the ideas in my own mind.
Sure. What was high school like?
Well, uh, I don't want
Tell,
to.
share what you can. This is a live show, so it's going to be.
High school is complicated for most teenagers, and I was in public school, so there was good parts and bad parts of it. I made a lot of good friends in high school that I'm still
Yeah.
close with today. Most people do. Um, I really feel privileged that I grew up in the '90s, specifically in the mid '90s. I often think I would hate to be a high schooler now.
Hmm.
I really feel grateful that I was part of the last generation to go through adolescence without the internet.
Hmm.
I just think if like pictures and things of me from high school would have been circulating on the internet now, it would just have been horrific. But so I uh, I made some great friends, great people that influenced me deeply. I also, I experimented with things too. I experimented with different belief systems, different spiritualities, different substances I experimented with. So I got into all sorts of things, and not all of it for the good. My family was a good family, but my parents were also very kind of laissez-faire. They were
Yeah.
very hands off. Um,
Don't you think that was
like
pretty common back then, though, in general?
I think it was. I think it was. When I talk to my students today about how hands off my parents were, they're kind of shocked. Like, I used to just go out and say, like, I'm going out, be back later. And
Right.
they wouldn't know where I was, and there was no phones. So, like, you couldn't call me, and they didn't know. They knew some of my friends, but they didn't even know who my friends were. They didn't know where I was, what I was doing.
Yep.
So, in those days, I guess an adolescent was more approximated to just a miniature adult than they are now. And I honestly wish it was more like that still to some degree, because I think kids are kind of stultified. But um, there's risks with that. There's benefits to that, but there's risks. And you simply have to accept that there's going to be risks. And I gambled with some things. When I was 16, I was arrested for being drunk at a party. Um, and I had to go before the judge and do community service, and I had various other experiences related to drug use, or just doing crazy things, just crazy teenage things. Let's go in the abandoned building and break the windows. Just like,
It's a good idea, right? It seems like a good
yeah,
idea.
yeah. So, I was kind of chaotic neutral, I guess. And came out of high, but I did good in high school despite all that. I came out of high school with pretty good grades. I was pretty creative, and I got a scholarship to the College for Creative Studies in Detroit, which was a prestigious art school. Um,
Wow.
my uncle had gone there, so I had like a family alumni, and I got a very generous scholarship to go study animation and illustration there.
No
Everybody at the time,
kidding.
yeah, everybody at the time had me pegged as an artist because I was a very good drawer. And my friend Jared, who's watching, he can testify to that. I was very, I was very artistic, and that's kind of what everybody assumed I was going to do. So I managed to kind of make it through high school, get a college scholarship in Detroit, and I was going to go off to school, but I was also very confused. I often tell people I went through a midlife crisis when I was 19.
Why
Um,
is that? What happened?
uh, well, I had I had experimented with lots of different kind of belief systems
Hmm.
and spiritualities, and I just kind of came away from everything very confused because, as anyone studies this stuff knows, there's lots of things in the world that people say. There's lots of political ideologies. There's lots of spiritualities. There's lots of religions, and there's people who don't believe anything. And as I grew, because I was always kind of a deep thinker, larger sort of existential and philosophical questions started pressing more heavier on my conscience. Like, what is the meaning of life? What is the good life? How should I be living? To what should I order everything? And because I didn't
Yeah.
have an anchor for that, everything seemed very meaningless. It's kind of like, you get up in the morning, you go to your crappy job to work for pennies, to buy some food, to pay your bills, so you can just scrap by, so you can have a place to sleep, so you can get up and do it all again the next day. Like, what is the purpose of that? Well, like, is that all there is to life? If that's all there is, why don't, is there any benefit to doing that for 80 years than just shooting myself? Like, is there any
Yeah.
difference? So I really struggle with big questions like, what's the meaning of my life and what should I be doing? And I became very nihilistic, very depressive and nihilistic, and kind of like a darkness came over me, a depressive darkness, and it really screwed up my college. I was too depressed and nihilistic to be able to focus on doing anything. I just wanted to sleep, and
Mm.
I just wanted to veg out or trip on acid or something, like
Hmm.
just kind of
Hmm.
like detach. And so I went from being a straight A student in high school to like getting D's in college. Um, and and I kind of entered a period of like existential crisis, not like not like a suicidal place really, although I thought about that, not in like a I want to die way, but in like a why am I like what's the point of being alive? Like,
Yep.
I, it's like in the big picture, I'm just another stupid amoeba in the pond of the universe that means nothing. And I really think if you embrace an atheistic view of the universe, I mean, ultimately it comes down to that when you think about the scale of things and the time of things, and even the most the biggest successes you could ever have in your life in the on the scale of you to the universe, they mean absolutely nothing, if there's no value to human existence. So those sorts of thoughts make it hard for you to concentrate on your homework, Glenn, is what I'm saying.
How old
um,
were you when that happened? Yeah, exactly. How old were
uh,
you?
19.
Do you think there was anything particular that triggered those questions, or it just happened?
um, yeah, I mean, like I said, I've always been a deep thinker, so I think it was worse for me than maybe it would have been for other people. But
Yeah.
also, I think my experiences triggered it because, like, when you do so many different things, when you experiment with so many different ideas and substances and different things, you kind of get to this point where you're like, I've like tried living this way, I've tried living that way, I've believed this, I've believed that, and you kind of feel like you've run out of options. But of course, there was one thing I didn't try, which I hadn't considered, which was Jesus Christ. Because most of us who are raised secular, we kind of are raised with Christianity as like a national, kind of like a national or Western, like symbols of the Western heritage, kind of like akin to Santa Claus
Yep.
or Zeus with his trident, or these symbols, And so I'd grown up with symbols of Jesus Christ, but in terms of like understanding the gospel or Christianity as a religion, a belief system, I'd never even considered that really. I mean, I had friends that were Christians, but I was just kind of like, like I didn't really think about it. But um, so I came to like a breaking point where I couldn't focus on anything, and I was having a kind of like a breakdown of sorts. But then I had a friend named John, who was a good friend of mine in high school, and he was a pretty serious Christian, and he was pretty intent on evangelizing his friends. He
Mm.
had gone through some similar stuff as me and kind of come out of it, and he was a very zealous kind of preacher. And he would go to parties and he would just sit there and tell people about Jesus at the parties, while everybody's sitting there getting high, and they're sitting there smoking or whatever, and John's like, you need Jesus, and people are like, whoa. So I was at a party, and I was very, very depressed, and I was listening to John talk about Jesus Christ to someone, and something like convicted me in my heart. Like they there's an old gospel hymn called "There's Power in the Name," right?
Hmm.
Um, and I really felt that, like, as he kept saying the name Jesus Christ, like I felt like every time the name was said, it rattled something inside of me in a way that no other name rattled. Like you could say Muhammad or Buddha or
Hmm.
anything, but when you said Jesus Christ, it was like there was some sort of power that the name was endowed with that was able to reach through and
Yeah.
pierce me. So he kept talking, and he wasn't even talking to me, he was talking to somebody else, and I was just listening. But it started convicting me, and the other person didn't listen. And then I turned to him after the other person walked away, and I said, I want that. And he said, okay. And he said, are you serious? And I was like, yes, because I'd kind of been, I'd heard this before from him, and I was just convicted, and something was laid on my heart that this was what the Lord wanted from me, or whatever the Lord was. I wasn't even sure what the Lord was. I was
Hmm.
pretty sure there was
No.
a God. I was sure there was a God, but I knew nothing about him. But for some reason, I knew that Jesus was the power. That if anyone could reach down and take my kind of like shattered, confused existence and make sense of it, that it would be him.
Mm.
So he said, "Let's go." John was a Pentecostal, you see. So John said, "Let's go down to the lake and have a good old fashioned baptizing." So we, you know,
Okay, so
we
you weren't baptized at this point.
I wasn't aware that I was. No, no.
Wow.
Now it turns out later that I actually was, but I just didn't know it. That's how
Gotcha.
That's how ignorant I was. My parents had baptized me Catholic as a baby, but I didn't even know that I was baptized.
Okay, yeah,
So,
keep going.
so he took me down to the lake in Howell, and it was about 2 in the morning. And we went into this is October 22nd, 1999. We went into the water, and he baptized me, and I instantly felt completely different. Like it was night and day. Like it was like I felt like I took my spirit off and put on a new one. It was crazy. Uh, I came out of the water and I was like staggering, like blinded with brilliant light in my mind. And I looked out at the sky and the trees, and it felt like I was looking at the creation for the first time ever, like I was Adam coming fresh from the hand of God. It was like such a powerful manifestation of God's mercy. And I knew instantly that I had changed, like irrevocably. So I fell to my knees and I raised my hands and I started just kind of spontaneously praising the Lord while my friend like kind of clapped and jumped around. And it was we must have looked like we were drunk if someone would have seen it. But, they thought the apostles were drunk on Pentecost too. So
Exactly.
we're in good company there. But I went home and I went to bed and I just thought we'll see if it wears off, because
Mm-hmm.
I'd had lots of experiences. Like I said, I'd tried lots of drugs and stuff, and I knew
Mm-hmm.
that things wear off. And so I woke up in the morning, and it was still with me, and it's been with me for since 1999 for 25 years now, and it stayed with me. The Lord stayed with me. He was good. And so I realized, like, I'm a Christian now. I'm not just a generic kind of cultural guy who celebrates Christmas, and I'm like I'm a follower of Jesus Christ. But I had to learn what that meant, so because I had really very little Bible knowledge or anything. I just had a powerful experience. So I started reading the Bible and like devouring it. I tried to read the Bible when I was younger, and it took me like 5 years to kind of like plod my like. I kind of tried to read it, and I like read parts of it. It took me 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
I must have read the whole thing like 3 times in a year after I became Christian. And I was very zealous. I made note cards. I wrote Bible verses down. I memorized them. I must have memorized 100 Bible verses. Now I was still in college at this time, but now I really couldn't focus on it. 'Cause, like I
Isn't that
couldn't focus on
funny?
it before, but now
Yeah.
I couldn't. So I dropped out. I didn't even wait for this. I didn't even finish the semester. Glenn,
No kidding.
just like John and James in the gospel that just dropped their nets.
Yeah.
I think it was early April maybe when I realized I could I just stopped going. Like I dropped it like with a month left in the semester and just stopped going. And eventually my college called and they're like, "Where are you?" And I'm like, "I'm done. I'm done." And they're like, "Okay, I guess we'll fill out the forms."
What did your friends
Um,
and family think about this? I mean, they must have seen you and thought, "Oh my gosh, what happened to this guy? We lost him."
yeah, yeah. That was the so Jesus says, "I've come not to bring peace, but a sword."
Mm.
That a man's household will be divided amongst himself, friend against friend, brother against brother, parent against children. It was a very contentious thing. Um, I basically started hanging around my other friends who were Christians also, and I stopped kind of hanging out with friends who were, more of a bad influence
Right.
because I was weak and I didn't want to slide back into the things that I'd just been delivered from. So, and when I did see those, and I still loved my old friends, but when I saw them sometimes, try to tell them about what happened, and then they didn't want to hear it, and it would
Right.
provoke religious arguments, and then, they called us the God Squad, and when me or John would show up, they'd be like, "Oh no, here they come," and it actually ripped the whole friend group apart. Most of
Mm.
my friends, some of us became Christians. Maybe 50% did, 50% didn't. But to this day, when I talk to my old friends, and it's kind of all water under the bridge now, but they will say, yeah, that whole when people converted, that was when the whole friend group ripped apart. And so basically, I made a lot of new friends and kind of had to let go of some old ones. Um, but my parents thought I'd lost it,
Yeah.
because I just dropped out, and I'd kind of looked like I'd become a religious fanatic. I would go up in my room and I would just watch the Jesus of Nazareth 1977 miniseries
Yeah.
on repeat, and I would just weep watching the movie.
Oh.
Um, and
Hey, I get
I
it. I love that thing. I used to watch the same thing over and over.
Yeah, I just watch it over and over again, and I would weep. And like,
Yeah.
this was before there was digital technology, so people that I knew would bring me back cassette tapes from, like, we'd like have mixed tapes of like praise and worship music, and there wasn't a lot of good Christian music back then. It could be argued that there still isn't, um, but like back then,
Oh
all I
my
was listening
gosh.
to,
Yeah.
all I had was like
Mm.
I had like a Promise Keepers tape from like the Promise Keepers conferences, and I had a Keith Green cassette that I listened to over and over
Oh
again,
yeah.
that I loved. And
Love Keith Green.
oh, I still love Keith Green. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was reading the Bible all the time, and I was always going out, and I'd tell my parents, like, I'm going to Bible study. I'm going I still wasn't going to church though. I was just
Mm.
like Bible studying and stuff. Um, you know, uh, my friends and I started building a cabin in the woods to, like, we built like a little kind of like cabin in the woods to, like, to hang out at and to do praise and worship, and we were going to just kind of live in the woods like religious hippies.
Oh
and
right.
uh and I was just working at a gas station, and I was saving my money, and then I would work, and then I'd take the money, and we'd go buy tools or food and go live at this shack in the woods. And so I was like, you got to understand, I was going from, like, I had a full scholarship in college to, like, I was like spending my time in the woods, like, as a religious hippie, like, doing like what must have looked like crazy fundamentalism. And I remember my mom was like, I don't know what you're doing, but you got to move out. Like, I'm not gonna, like, you got no ambition in your life. She told me, like, if you're gonna
Mm-hmm.
keep up like this, you have to leave. So I remember I sat down with my mom and I said, look, I know this is weird, but here's what happened to me. And I tried to tell her a little bit of it, and she was like, and I
Mm-hmm.
said, and I had the Bible open before on the table, and I was like, I apologized to her for all the bad things I did as a kid. And I was like, this is what I'm going through. And then she kind of like let up and was like, okay, you can stay. Um, but so I was, yeah, we used to walk around town barefoot, like on purpose, like as a sign of like religious hippieism, and just like talk to random strangers about Jesus. And it was fun. And
Mm-hmm.
the Lord was good to us, and I saw many miraculous things. You mentioned you had 6 healings at your conference. I saw I saw miraculous things. I saw healings. I saw things that confirmed that the Lord was there and that He was real. I believe I saw demons being driven out of people at various
Yep.
times. I saw
Yep.
all sorts of things that confirmed me in this. But what I couldn't understand was, as I spent more time with other believers, nurturing my faith life, I kind of came to the conclusion that not everybody understood the Bible the same way I did. So I'd read the Bible and I'd be like, like a huge argument we had was like whether we should be smoking, because for most of us started smoking at like 14 or 15, and it was really associated with kind of like that bad boy,
Mm-hmm.
like, kind of bad boy secular upbringing. So the question was, now that we've been like redeemed, should we still be smoking, or is that like a symbol of our previous bondage?
Mm.
And some of us were like, this is absolutely sinful to smoke, like it's an addiction, and then other people were like, oh well, God made all the plants,
There you
and there's
go.
nothing wrong with smoking, and um, it's a harmless, well, it's not harmless, but there's, if we said every unhealthy thing was a sin, then I couldn't eat candy bars or whatever. And So, and then the problem was, Glenn, was that reading the Bible was no help to solve the dilemma because the Bible doesn't say whether you can smoke cigarettes or not. So we just kind of argue round and round. And, but then arguments about bigger things too. Like I had been baptized and other people hadn't. And it was like, is that necessary? Like, do we all need to be baptized? Or like, once you're saved, and like let's say you slip up and commit a serious sin, uh or you abandon it, like do you actually lose your salvation? Like if I commit a serious sin and then I like am I unsaved and I need to get saved again? Like, and we just kind of went round and round on this, um the Christians I knew, and we went to various different churches too to try. I started going to
Sure.
churches. And the first one I went to was the First Presbyterian Church in Howell, which had some. I think the first like kind of mature Christians that reached out to me were Presbyterians. I had some friends whose parents were like elders in the Presbyterian Church, and they reached out to me and some of my friends, and they would like let us come to their house and kind of like give us a stable place to hang out, so we weren't in a shack in the woods.
Hmm.
Um, and we go to their church, but like I was kind of scandalized by their church because I'd go into the church and everybody was like dressed so nice, which is fine. We should dress nice, but it was like the wealthy church. And then like I'd go to
Mm.
sit down and somebody'd be like, "Oh, don't sit there. That's the McPherson's pew." And I'm
Mm.
like, "Oh, the McPhersons, like I can't sit in there." And like it was kind of like where the moneyed classes of the town went to
Mm.
church. And as someone who was like walking around on the street barefoot and dirty
Right.
and like
Right.
preaching to people like wild-eyed with a Bible in my hand, like that was scandalous. So I started looking for a church that would preach the real gospel. And that led me on like a 2-year circus of, I went to all these little house churches where there was kind of like non-denominational people preaching, like, and they would have a message where it's like it's not religion, it's a relationship. You have to have a relationship
Yep.
with Jesus. And that's all good. I had a relationship with Jesus, but I was not looking for that. I was looking for intellectual clarity on what the teaching of Christianity actually is. Does Christianity say you have to be baptized, or does it not? Does it say, like, what is the Holy Spirit? What is, all these questions that I wanted intellectual clarity on. And nobody could really, I mean, basically, I figured out in these 2 years, I got introduced to the world of denominations. And I mainly bounced around charismatic / Pentecostal denominations because
Hmm.
that's what I had kind of like come into. But everywhere I went, it just provoked, an argument or not an argument, but like more questions. So I go to the Pentecostal church. They're all speaking in tongues. I don't speak in tongues. Do I need to speak in tongues? They'd be like, well, yes, you do. And then other people would say, no, you don't. And then I'd go to another church and there'd be like a woman preaching. And I'd be like, but St. Paul says women aren't supposed to preach right there in the New Testament. Why are you preaching? And they'd be like, well, that's if you interpret it this way, then, and uh,
Yep.
Glenn, I even went with my friend John down to an all African American church in Detroit, in a very poor part of Detroit, where we were the only white people in the church, and where they worship by, like
Hmm.
clapping and like this sort of stuff. And we were like, like doing this. And because I thought, maybe I need to seek the Lord amongst the poorest of the poor, because that was, one of Jesus' messages. So, anyhow, I went to all these churches, and in the end, I just came to the conclusion that the Bible alone was not able to give clarity on all these questions, and that basically all you had was basically you choose which denomination suited your character or your personality. If you were very emotional, you choose to be Pentecostal. If you liked stuffy suits and organ playing, you went to the Presbyterian church. Whatever. But then I discovered a little church called the Charismatic Episcopal Church. You ever heard of that?
No.
Um, these are Episcopalians who want to also be charismatic. And so I went to this church. It was in a little historic wedding chapel in town. And this was the first church where I was exposed to liturgy because they were Episcopalians. So they had things that I didn't see in the Pentecostal low churches. They had
Mm.
altars, candles, incense, vestments, liturgy. It was base. Say that three times fast. Charismatic
Yeah.
Episcopal. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they had actual liturgy, and I'd never seen liturgical worship. Right. In the low church Protestant world, it's all more like in the praise and worship vein, which I was growing increasingly disillusioned with because I didn't want more just feelings.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't need to raise my hands and say yes, Jesus. I needed concrete answers about what the Bible means.
Right.
And so I discovered liturgical worship, and this was such a weird little denomination. They worshipped liturgically with basically the Episcopalian liturgy. They were very traditional in how they observed it. So like the pastor here, he actually wore like a beretta, like with the little ball on the top.
Yeah. Yeah.
He
Yeah.
looked he wore a cassock. He looked like a Catholic priest. But then like halfway through the liturgy, they'd be like, "We're going to speak in tongues now," and then they'd just speak in tongues for 5 minutes, and then they'd go back to like a very formalized liturgy. It was such like a weird Frankenstein service, but it introduced me to liturgical worship and, more important, to the concept of Holy Communion, which I'd never encountered before.
Mm.
Because in Protestant churches, in many of them, like in the charismatic / Pentecostal Assemblies of God sort of um, circles, you basically just have the Lord's Supper, and the way they celebrate it is there's kind of like once a month, everybody takes this little oyster cracker and
Right.
then they just drink a little cup of juice, and it's supposed to be a symbol. But in the liturgical worship of the charismatic Episcopal Church, it was very much like what we would experience at maybe a very well done Novus Ordo liturgy, where there's like an altar rail and there's like a priest holding up a host and like distributing it to you. And I absolutely fell in love with the rite of communion, as I understood it, because it was a level of it represented a level of intimacy that was more objective. It wasn't just about how do I feel today. It was like, this is the Lord Jesus coming to you in a very sacramental way. And I started learning about sacraments. Now, the Charismatic Episcopal Church does have valid holy orders, which they got through some weird schismatic bishop in Brazil 30 years ago.
No kidding.
Yeah, I didn't know, but see, I don't know if it did them any good because they didn't believe in the real presence. They
Oh,
believed kind of like in
yeah.
like consubstantiation. So I honestly don't know what they were confecting because they had holy
Interesting.
orders, but they didn't believe in transubstantiation. But anyhow,
Very
the point
strange.
is, the point is, I fell in love with liturgy,
Hmm.
and I saw that this was the solution to the problem of how I should worship. Because even though it's not, it's nice to get loose and be like, I can express myself, but when you do that day after day, week after week, year after year, it starts to become formalized, right? It
Yep.
starts to become like, I go into church, I clap, I raise my hands, we go like this, I sing the song for 20 minutes, and it's like, that is the liturgy. You're doing a liturgy, you just don't realize it. You're doing a formalized ritual, and it puts a lot of burden on you, on the believer, to always stir up the emotions that you need to do that. And so I started thinking, if I'm going to be doing something repetitive, why not do something that is traditional, that's been handed on, that kind of like does the work for me, where I don't always have to manufacture my feelings. I can enter into the what the rite hands me, and then I can just let the Lord do his thing. Um, so I'm like, this is great. And then I'm just starting to really get into it. And then the pastor of that church converts to Catholicism.
Oh, you're
just
kidding.
yeah, just one day we go to church and they're like, yeah, Pastor Mike is gone. He became Catholic. I
Oh
was
my
like, oh,
goodness. So you must have
so
you chatted with him. Like, what's? Did you talk to him about why?
no, he skipped town. He skipped town as if he was a
Oh,
fugitive.
man.
He was from the South, and he skipped town and went back to the South. So now, at this point, obviously, I had encountered Catholicism, because I would ask these people at this church, what is this you do? What are you doing? And they're like, oh, this is a very ancient rite that goes back to the early church. And they would call themselves Catholic. So the charismatic Episcopal Church called themselves Catholic, but they would be like, oh, not like a big C Catholic, like small c. Or they'd say, oh, not Roman Catholic, though. We're like Catholic, but not Roman Catholic. So basically, every time I would encounter something that was interesting, they'd be like, well, yeah, this is like something the Catholics do too, or that we got from the Catholics, but we're not Catholics. And I'm kind of like, at a certain point, Glenn, I started being like, why do you exist? Like, because it basically was like a halfway house for people for Anglicans who were not ready to become Catholic yet, but didn't want to be Anglican,
Yeah.
because there was constantly, I discovered people going from this denomination into Catholicism. Because you start to get to a point where you're like, if everything in your heritage and your ritual comes from Catholicism, why aren't you Catholic then? And so this brought me to studying Catholicism, the liturgy specifically, and discovering tradition. Because when I got to Catholicism, I discovered that all these questions I'd been wrestling with had answers. Where, like, you could look at the Catholic tradition and be like, oh yeah, baptism, we believe, it's necessary. Oh yeah, the Holy Spirit, this, communion, this. And here's the difference, though. The Catholic faith, because of its antiquity, could boast an unbroken succession of professing the same faith. I could read.
Yep.
I remember the experience of reading Saint Ignatius of Antioch, who was so ancient that he knew John and Peter. And reading Saint Ignatius and seeing him expressing the same faith that was professed, by Catholics today. And I was like, this is the difference. All these other churches I've been going to, they kind of came into existence at a certain point in time based on the founders' interpretation of the Bible. But in Catholicism, you have an unbroken chain of interpretation that goes back to the apostolic age, and that you can see in the texts, and you say, okay, the people who literally knew the apostles interpreted the Bible this way. That is the interpretation. And this really came home to me when I was reading the scriptures, and I was in a Protestant seminar. Long story, but I was in like a seminar, and the Protestant guy he had a PowerPoint, and he put up a PowerPoint, the Bible verse, and it was a Bible verse from Thessalonians that talked about, like, that was St. Paul saying, the people that I heard the gospel from, I'm passing on to you, and you pass it on to other people so they can teach other people as well. And it was kind of laid out for me. It's like, oh my gosh, that's like the succession of
Yep.
the faith being handed on. When Paul says in the Bible, hold fast to the tradition, whether by word of mouth or by letter, this is what he's talking about. We have the Bible, obviously, but the Bible is a book that doesn't interpret itself. But then you look to the tradition, and the tradition is like a tradition that part of that tradition is how the church has thought about the Bible and interpreted it. And that's why Paul says, hold fast to the tradition, whether by word of mouth or by letter. And all of a sudden, I knew that if I was unclear on what the Bible meant, I could look to the tradition that would clarify that for me. And so this is how I first became exposed to Catholicism.
Wow, what a great story. There's some real clear parallels between you and I. That was my beginning too. I was, again, we'll get back to you in a second, but it was very similar. I was touched by the Holy Spirit, and it was wonderful. I was hanging out with a bunch of Protestants, and things weren't adding up, and I couldn't figure out why weren't they adding up, but I couldn't prove anything.
Yeah.
And there was a big question about who can be saved. Do you have to have this experience to be saved? And the answer was yes. And I thought, well, I know some people who haven't. Then are they going to hell? And the answer was yeah. And I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. Let's slow down a little bit. So this is great. Great. Keep going.
Well, it really blew away my paradigm, because coming through Protestantism, I had this paradigm of like, it's relationship, not religion, right?
Right.
Like religion's almost a bad word in Protestantism. But as Protestantism continues to fragment and you get down to the level of like mega churches and things like that, and mega churches do a lot of good, in the community, so I'm not digging on them, but you get down to where it's almost like the lowest kind of level of belief where it's like, we believe in God, we believe in Jesus, we believe that you're saved by believing in Jesus. And as for all those other questions, we're not going to really talk about them. We're just going to focus on doing good in the community and being good people. And to where if I'm asking, like, is Jesus truly God and man? Is he, does the Holy Spirit proceed from the Father and the Son? Like, they don't really
Mm-hmm.
dig down to that level. So Protestantism in its development in the United States has been like a constant shedding of ritual and doctrine, until some churches you go to today, they don't feel like church at all. It's kind of like an auditorium where you're listening to a TED talk. And some people will say that's great, but for me, I had the opposite reaction. See,
Mm.
I needed God to be transcendent. I see normal junk out in the world every day. I see lots of auditoriums, lots of people giving talks. What I need is something I don't see in the world every day. I need a 2,000-year-old liturgy that has come down from antiquity and was practiced by the apostles and their successors. That's what I need. That's something
Mm.
that helps me experience the timelessness. But anyhow, um, I started studying Catholicism, and I didn't have many doctrinal objections to it because I could see the beautiful harmony of the teaching. I saw how it harmonized everything, not just in the Bible, but in human nature, in ethics, in spirituality. Everything had this beautiful hierarchy and harmony that was holistic, and that you could, like in Catholicism, I've been Catholic for 22 years now, and I feel like I've barely scratch the surface of the riches there are to consider and contemplate and study.
Mm.
100 lifetimes wouldn't be enough because it's such a huge heritage. But I was very worried about the pragmatic side of things. I started going to daily mass, and it was all old people. It was like
Mm-hmm.
gray. It was like all blue hairs.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, and I'm like 21 years old. And I'm like, oh, like if I convert, am I just going to be hanging out with elderly people for
Yep.
the rest of my, like, where's the young people? I was worried about the papacy. I was like, what if the Pope commands something stupid, or that I don't like, or I was unsure about devotion to Mary. I saw Catholics, making toasts to the name of the Blessed Mother, or talking about, with one of the very first times I went to mass, some guy creeped me out by trying to give me a Fatima DVD or something.
Mm.
He saw I was new, and he tapped me on the shoulder. He's like, "Have you ever heard of Fatima?" And he's like trying to hand me it. I'm like, "What are you talking about?"
Yeah.
You imagine you're just barely understanding Catholicism, and then you run into some Fatima people that
Oh
are
yeah.
like, I'm not ready for Sister Lucia's visions, you know. But at any rate, I got a little plastic rosary, and I started praying the rosary. I just took it on faith. I didn't understand it. I didn't really like it. I didn't really feel like I needed Marian devotion, but I was smart enough to see that every serious Catholic throughout history highly praised Marian devotion. And so I started praying it, and it kind of transformed my spiritual life. And now, 22 years on, I absolutely love the Blessed Mother. Those people who follow me on Facebook know that sometimes I randomly will post just pictures of Mary statues. I'm like, isn't it beautiful? Like, I
Mm.
love the Blessed Mother now. But the one other thing that pushed me over the edge, I was worried that, like, well, basically what I'm saying, Glenn, is I was worried that the stereotype of Catholics might be true. The stereotype of, like, this is just a crusty old church with a bunch of people going through the motions, and maybe you discovered something rich in it, but that doesn't mean everybody else did. That
Yeah.
doesn't mean that grandma here, who's been going to mass since 1958, that she has had these experiences that you have had. And maybe the stereotypes about it are true. But in this formative time when I was leading up to this, I discovered a saint who changed my life, which was Saint Francis of Assisi. And I was actually introduced to him by a Protestant friend of mine.
No kidding.
Uh, yeah, he had gone out to live with the Jesus people in California.
Oh sure.
And for those of you who don't know, the Jesus people are kind of like urban hippies who have like a commune, and they basically just serve the poor in the cities. Um, and he brought back a movie called Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon by Franco Zeffirelli, who also did Jesus of Nazareth, the miniseries. Is from 1971. It's very dated, but he gave it to me, and I watched it, and I just like bawled watching this movie because St. Francis's story resonated so deeply with me. Where you got this guy who had like a nice middle class upbringing, and he was popular and doing well, and then he entered a kind of existential crisis in his early 20s, and then he had a powerful conversion, and then his family thought he was crazy, and then his friends repudiated him. And I was like, holy cow, this is exactly what happened to me. And then I started discovering that this has happened to millions of people. I read St. Augustine's Confessions, and I was like, holy cow, it happened to him,
Mm-hmm.
men who were much greater than I. But anyhow, I was so impressed with St. Francis's zeal for the Lord and his love of poverty and his absolutely beautiful soul. Nothing makes me tear up like talking about Francis of Assisi. I absolutely love him, and I
Mm.
believe that he pushed me over the edge. Because Francis was so zealous, and I was like, you know what? I want whatever religion created this man. That's the religion I want. And all of a sudden,
Mm.
all the other objections kind of just seemed inconsequential. So I went to my local Catholic church and was like, I want to start RCIA. And they were like, okay, were you baptized as a baby? And I asked my mom, and she was like, yeah, you were actually. And I was like, what? And she's like, yeah. And she pulled out my baptism certificate, and I was baptized Catholic as a baby. So I was Catholic the whole time.
Mm.
I was like, I just didn't realize it. And so the pastor said, well, since you're technically already Catholic, all you need to do is make a confession, and we can admit you to Holy Communion right away. And then you'll just need to be confirmed at Easter and go through the RCIA classes. So I was fortunate. A lot of people have very bad experiences in RCIA. I
Yep.
had the greatest possible RCIA teachers I could have.
Mm.
Like one of my RCIA teachers was the editor of Servant of God John Harden's works.
You're kidding.
And yeah, and he knew Mother Teresa, and um, like I was
Wow.
yeah, and like a couple other of them were like, I mean, everybody I knew that taught my RCIA had impeccable pedigrees, and they were good at teaching the faith. And so my pastor, after about 2 months in RCIA, he was like, you're ready to come into the church. Is there any, in October, is there any, particular date, a Sunday? He told me to look at the Sundays in October and if there was any dates that stuck out to me. And I looked at the first Sunday in October that year, which was October 4th.
Oh,
And
you're
it said,
kidding me.
no, it said on the calendar, it said Feast of St. Francis of Assisi.
Yep.
And I was like, oh, like I'm getting teary eyed now thinking about it, honestly. I break,
Got my Franciscan shirt
oh,
on.
yeah, represent. No, I cry every single time I get to this part in
Wow.
the testimony because I love St. Francis so much, and he was so good. The Lord gave him to me like a guardian angel to move me along and to keep me on the right path. I um so I asked to be received into the church on the feast of Francis of Assisi, and I was, and then I made my first Holy Communion there. And yeah, so that was in 2002. And yeah, so um that was when I came into the church, and it's you know, I wish I could say it was all clear sailing from there. I mean, really, as I said earlier, you look back in your past and you think these are the definitive moments of conversion. Um, this is the end of one story, the beginning of another, but it never really ends. When you open a new door, there's just another journey behind that door, until we enter our heavenly home. So, that opened up a whole new journey of learning what does it mean to live as a Catholic, and sorting those things out. And I've learned over time that, like, faith is a struggle. Faith isn't easy.
Yep.
uh, Jacob wrestled with an angel, and the Catechism says that's the sign of prayer is wrestling. We wrestle with God. Um, I think that's the name of Jordan Peterson's new book on religion, We Who Wrestle with
Oh,
God, actually. But faith always involves a little bit of not knowing, right? It says in the New Testament that now I see in part, but then in heaven I will see fully. Now I see through a mirror darkly, then everything will be revealed. So a lot of people get tripped up with various things of faith, like I don't understand this. Why did this happen to me? Like I often wonder, at the beginning of my story, my friend was preaching to another guy, and that guy rejected the gospel and went his way, and I was just happened to be there, and I said yes to it. Why did that guy reject it, and I said yes? What
yeah.
happened to that? What happened to that guy? Where's he at? Right now, I don't know. People struggle with various questions, but what I've learned is that we have to be comfortable with looking through the glass darkly. That not in a sense of like a blind, stupid faith, like blind faith is just like, yeah, I'm going to win the lottery today. It's like it's not grounded in reason at all. But living active faith is saying like, I don't see the big picture. I don't see where the path goes. I feel like I'm walking through the fog, but I trust the person who's guiding me. I trust the Lord who is the
Mm,
shepherd. And because I trust him, I can walk in confidence. And I guess I'll just say one more thing. I was, one thing I love about little children, and the Lord says we should be as little children. This shows us how to have faith. If you have a little kid, you can go to a little kid. They're maybe 5, they're playing, and you can say, "Hey, get your shoes on. We're going somewhere." And they just get up and they put their shoes on and they go get in the car. You know, they have such perfect confidence and faith in their parents that like
yeah.
I don't need to know what's going on. Daddy says we're going somewhere. But then if you say the same thing to a 15-year-old, they're like, "Where are we going? Why? Do I have to?" Then they
Yeah.
start, you know what I mean? So
Oh, yeah,
the
yeah.
Lord says we should be as little children, and I've learned in this walk that like you have to be okay with wrestling with the not knowing. And if you can be okay with that, then there's a great peace and a confidence that arises and that people will see and be like, wow, that's really attractive, the sort of faithfulness that is being manifested there. So anyhow, there's much more that could be said, but that's where I'll toss it back to you.
Just one quick observation.
Yeah.
I talked to a friend of mine who's a priest in the Diocese of Sioux Falls,
Yeah. Yeah.
and he has a similar story. But what happened to you is what happened to me.
Yeah.
We caught on to something. I started hearing God speak to me when I was in basic training in 1988.
Mm-hmm.
Again, not voices out, not hearing voices, but these thoughts coming in my head. Is God real?
Right.
And so
Yeah.
I'm wrestling, and I made a retreat and realized God had to be real. But that
Mm.
wasn't enough for me. Uh, I was touched by the Spirit of God. And
Yeah.
that's what changed everything for me. I didn't know the doctrines of the faith very well. I went to Catholic school, grades 1 through 6, but I didn't know the doctrines. I didn't know anything about the
Sure.
Bible. I
Sure.
couldn't tell you where the Gospel of John was. But when I was touched by the Spirit, um, I had this hunger for God, and I had this. I had to know the truth. I had to know the deposit of faith, right? All the teachings.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went on this spree of learning. Same thing happened to Father, the priest that I know in the Diocese of Sioux Falls. That kind of happened to you as well. You were touched by God, and then, am I right? You just kind of had to know.
Yeah. The way I think about it is, God touched me at a certain point, and like, you know how they say like in outer space, like if you push something, it'll just keep moving forever until it until it hits something.
Right.
It's kind of like at a certain point in God was preparing me. He was kind of like preparing me for something for my whole life, and then at a certain point, he shoved me in a certain trajectory, and I feel like I'm still. Everything that's happened to me since then is kind of like an outgrowth of being shoved in that trajectory. He just filled me with an insatiable hunger to learn, to persevere, to understand the spiritual life. And I don't claim in any way to have arrived. Like I said, the
Yeah.
further you go, the further you realize I could spend 100 lifetimes working with this, and it wouldn't be enough. You know, but the effort, it's one of those things where the journey is the destination in a way. The prodigal son,
Hmm.
all he needed to do was resolve that he was going to come home. And even though he had to walk to get to his father's house, in a way, as soon as he turned to go home, in his heart, he was home, once you make that turning towards the Lord and he reaches out and has, touches you in grace. So yeah, I would say that's exactly it. And it's happened to so many people since I have shared my story. Many other people have reached out and said this happened to me. I've heard so many other convert stories of God reaching people in various different places, stories very different to mine. I love hearing how people are reached,
Mm.
and it's endlessly fascinating to me. So I praise him for his mercy and for all the people he put in my life that brought me to where I am. So yeah.
Do you ever find yourself, or do you think God ever leads you back to some of that early charismatic prayer like you once had?
Not in the sense of I don't know. I mean, sometimes when I'm driving, and I'm
Mm.
listening to music, like I like to, I pull one of these out or something,
Yeah.
when I'm feeling it. I've never felt the urge to go back to like a structured charismatic worship, in the sense of like in a church service. I kind of had my fill of that, and now I prefer Latin and Gregorian chant and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because again, it helps me to plug into the history of I mean, I'm a history teacher, so for me, feeling like I plug into the history is very important to me. That's why, like, even among my Catholic friends, I have Catholic friends who are like, dude, like, you are really like gung ho about relics, like even more than most Catholics. Like, I'm that guy that's going to every church looking for the relics to touch my scapular to them,
Mm.
uh, because I recently went to England and went out at midnight to wait for the tide to drop so I could cross a strait in the ocean to get to a little island that a saint used to live on, so I could see the place where he lived in his hermitage and
Mm.
touch my rosary to the ground where he stood. And as like, I'm kind of nuts about relics and stuff like that because I love the historical connection to the saints and to the history of the church. But on an emotional level, there are times, of course, when things strike me. I still will put on Keith Green, when I'm
Mm.
driving. I'll listen to him. I will cry. I never want to feel like I can't. I think maturity in the Lord is realizing, like, even if you've outgrown a stage, you don't have to reject anything that was valuable to you. Like,
Yeah.
I've gotten to a point where I don't go by my emotions anymore, but we certainly should still be able to connect with our emotions, and sometimes I like to. Um, yeah, but yeah, that's kind of where my spirituality is at right now. But it's still
Sure.
growing. I'm still learning. I'm still walking.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to see if we have any questions for you online. A lot of comments. The surprise baptism, said Genevieve Norris.
Yeah.
Yeah, were your parents present when you came into the church fully?
Yes, actually, there's a nice side story. When I told my mom I was coming to the church, my mom had been raised Catholic and had abandoned the faith, and she decided that she wanted to go to RCIA as well. So she joined RCIA, and then she got reconciled with the church through me coming into the church. So my mom has now been a practicing Catholic for 22 years as well now, as a result of me coming back to the church. And my father, even though he hasn't become Catholic, he's become very supportive of it over the years, and really values Catholicism. He's known all our priests. He's been to every every special. He comes to the parish festivals, like everything. Comes to the choir concert. So he's Catholic adjacent, we'll say.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So it kind of had a big effect on my whole family.
Well, listen, I'm so grateful. This is such a fun story. I had no idea what I was getting into. It was a surprise for me. I'm really interested in there's so many parallels. We're at an hour, a little over an hour now. So, but the parallels are very interesting. Both of our stories started with really Protestants and
Yeah.
the charismatic renewal and being touched by God and then having to know the truth. And I grew up Catholic. You were baptized Catholic, and I was surprised to find myself fully embracing the Catholic Church as I was on my
Yeah.
way out. I was on my way out after a year, and because nothing was making sense biblically, but I was
Yeah.
listening to a lot of my Protestant friends, and I couldn't defend my faith. So,
Yeah.
but in the end, I started listening to Scott Hahn out
Oh
of
yeah, I listen to him too.
tape, and just tape after tape after, and just re-listen. And he really taught me the faith. And then I was so surprised because I wanted out of the Catholic Church.
Yeah, yeah.
One quick
I think
question. Go ahead. Go ahead.
as I say, I think once someone starts listening to Scott Hahn tapes, they're done for pretty much.
Yeah. So why history? I mean, you're a history teacher. Why history? That's your passion.
I don't know. It's been with me since I was little. I've always been interested in it, and after I dropped out of art school and became clear I wasn't going to become an artist, I thought, I could make a living teaching history, which I actually love,
Yeah.
and so I went back. I went back to study that at a Catholic school this time because I was Catholic by that time, at Ave Maria, and then I actually did I did a whole degree at Ave Maria. Graduated graduated in only 3 years in a 4-year program. I did it accelerated. I was the first student at Ave Maria to ever submit a thesis for the Department of History, which is now a book that I've published called Power from on High, if anyone wants to see it. And then I went to Madonna University and did a 5-year program to learn about education so I could teach. So I've studied education formally as well. So pretty well-rounded in that regard. But yeah, history was just a no-brainer. It was just something that was so integral to who I was and how I understood the world. I very much understand the world in terms of, continuity with the past. So,
Okay, who do you love to read? Who's your go-to?
For what subject?
Not economics. I know you. I think you have a hobby in economics, don't you? It's a sort of a hobby for you.
A hobby? Yeah, kind of. I studied that in college as well. So, no. I guess I don't have any one author I go to really, but recently in my spiritual reading, I've been reading Father Jacques Philippe, who is a very well-known French priest who writes very good books about the interior life that I've been really loving. I always have a Jacques Philippe book nearby, and I often have multiple copies because I like giving them to people. He really helps you to have a solid, peaceful balance in your spiritual life and not be perturbed by the craziness that's going on around you, which is what everybody needs more. And by the way, one more thing I really want to say.
Okay.
I've talked a lot about in this talk about kind of coming out of Protestantism. Obviously doctrinally, I disagree with Protestants fundamentally, but I don't dunk on Protestants. I wouldn't have faith today if it wasn't for gifts that Protestants gave me. If it wasn't for the Methodist church that I went to as a child and, walked by and saw the room, if it wasn't for my Pentecostal friend John, if it wasn't for the Charismatic Episcopal Church that taught me what the liturgy was, there's all these people along the way that gave me little gifts, and those gifts all bore fruit. And the Lord used those people. He used them. And so even though I doctrinally disagree with Protestants, and they gave me a lot of things I disagree with, but they gave me a lot of things that were good as well. They were kind of like a basket of helpful things and unhelpful things. And for every helpful thing that I was given by a Protestant, I'm truly grateful to God for, because God uses many different things to bring people to Him. You've probably heard crazy stories of God finding people and using crazy means to speak to them, So I just want to say to my Protestant friends out there, I love you and thank you for all the good things that you gave me that helped make me who I am today.
Amen. That's a great way to wrap up. I completely agree. Same thing for me too. A lot of Protestants loved me up. It seems like that when there were times working in the Catholic Church that I got beat up, and there were a couple times, it was always the Protestants who sort of brought me in and loved me up and took care of my wounds. And then boom, I went back into it again. So listen, ladies and gentlemen, I'm so grateful for Mr. Phillip Campbell to be with on the Glen Gauer podcast live show tonight. A great story. Again, I had no idea what I was getting into, but the parallels between you and I are just crazy.
Yeah.
It's really, really fun. So, any final thought?
Just if you're out there watching and you in terms of like if you need history classes for your children, I'd like to direct you to where I teach, which is Homeschool Connections, and you can look that up. You can look that up online, and there's a list of all my classes, homeschoolconnections.com, and you can search for history Phillip Campbell. And I have tons of classes, over live classes. I have over 40 recorded classes. And if you've never heard of Homeschool Connections, I encourage you to check it out.
How about books? Where can they get your books? What books do you have?
Oh gosh, I've authored over 20 books at this point.
Oh,
So
wow.
if you just go, I'm just going to refer you to. You can just go to my website, phillipcampbell.net, and then click books, and I have a list of books that I've written. Or if you just go on Amazon and just look for Phillip Campbell, Catholic author, it'll bring up everything I've done.
So Genevieve says that was a great show. I really enjoyed listening in. Thank you,
Genevieve is a wonderful student, and thank you for being here, Genevieve.
Well, God bless you. God bless all those who are listening. Genevieve, you too. Thanks again, Phillip, for joining us. And remember, ladies and gentlemen, you are loved. And may God strengthen the bars of your gates. God bless you. Good night, everybody.